Wow. In a word, in the eyes of the U.S. administration, Putin has gone from pariah to potential partner. And that's quite a big change. That's the verdict of the BBC's Russia editor Steve Rosenberg as he talks about the fallout between that phone call on Wednesday night between Vladimir Putin of Russia and President Donald Trump of the USA, where they well restarted their relationship and also talked about Ukraine. Without Ukraine, what does it all mean? We discuss that on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and we are recording the first half of this episode of Newscast at 7:15 on Thursday evening and all day. There have been events, reactions, comments about what Donald Trump said to Vladimir Putin in their phone call on Wednesday night, when the two of them seemed to agree that they would start negotiations about what will happen to Ukraine, negotiations that didn't necessarily seem to involve Ukraine itself. So, we'll catch up with lots of our colleagues about that. And the first person we're going to head to is Chief International Correspondent Le Douay, and she is in Munich, where loads of big names from the world of diplomacy and international security are gathering this weekend and where this will be the main subject of conversation. So, let's have a conversation now with Lee Duet. Hi Lee, hello from Munich. Well, it's quite amazing that all this stuff has happened as basically everyone who's got an interest in European security gathers in Munich for this annual conference where you're at now. This is the extraordinary thing about the Munich Security Conference, is, as you know, Adam, the calendar now is chock-a-block around the world. So many countries and organizations want to have their conference in the diaries of the most powerful players on Earth. But the Munich Security Conference, which has been around for decades, and I've been coming for more than a decade, is the place where things happen. Real diplomacy, real-time diplomacy happens in Munich. And when people come here, they don't just talk. They make deals, they come to understandings, they move the dial on world crisis. It's become more difficult, I have to say, in recent years because, for example, the Russians used to come, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, used to drop bombshells in the main hall and causing anger, but among a lot of the European delegates. But at least you had all sides talking. The Iranians used to come here as well. Even Vladimir Putin made a famous speech here in Munich, but it is still the place where the Americans, the Europeans, ministers from across the Middle East. There'll be discussions of all of the issues which matter. Of course, Ukraine President Zelensky will be here as well, and we're expecting that he will meet the Vice President J.D. Vance, and the Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, will be here of the U.S., and I would imagine also the Defense Secretary, who's been creating waves in Brussels with his comments about Ukraine. Well, yeah, and the bombshells that have been dropped in the last 24 hours are Donald Trump saying that he's spoken to Vladimir Putin on the phone, and they both agreed their negotiating teams would meet and start talks about what to do about Ukraine. And then sort of the associated bombshells from Secretary of Defense Heth, saying that Ukraine should give up on the idea of going back to its pre-24 borders. So before Russia's first invasion of Crimea, and also that Ukraine should give up on the idea of NATO membership. What do we know now about what the US's position actually is? Well, as your comment suggests, that we don't know a lot yet about what was discussed in that 90-minute telephone conversation. That's how it's being described between President Putin and President Trump. But the very fact of that phone call is a bombshell, diplomatic bombshell in itself. We know what we know of the American position has mainly come in detail from those comments you just cited by the U.S. Defense Secretary, and he made them in Brussels at the NATO meeting, so they really did fall what they were explosive. There, I think we were quite stunned that he should what, as the Europeans have been saying today, is that they have essentially taken off the table the kind of issues that should be in the thick of the negotiations, bargaining chips between the Ukrainians and the Russians. And as the Europeans would say it, the Europeans also have to be at thatable if there are to be negotiations which can be seen as anagoti between equal partners. That to have win-win for all sides, with all sides, of course, having to make compromises, but not having to give everything, not one side giving everything away. And we can hear a bit more about what we think happened in that phone call. because I've been speaking earlier on today on Thursday with our Russia editor Steve Rosenberg in Moscow, and here's his take from the Russian angle. Hello, Adam. So give me your interpretation then of this phone call. Wow. I mean, in a W word, I mean, we knew it was going to happen. We've been waiting for this phone call ever since Donald Trump was reelected. But actually, when it actually happens and you see the readouts, you see what Donald Trump writes you, see what the Kremlin writes, you realize how everything has changed, right? Because for 3 years, we got used to the Biden administration, referring to Donald Trump, referring to Vladimir Putin as a murderous dictator and having nothing to do with him. No phone calls, no contacts. Here we have a new U.S. president who clearly wants to build a relationship with valid Putin. And reading Trump's comments about the phone call on social media, he thanked Vladimir Putin for the conversation. He praised Vladimir Putin's common sense. He said he wanted to work together closely with President Putin to end the war in Ukraine. So it's a very different kind of language, a different approach to Vladimir Putin. In short, in the eyes of the U.S. administration, Putin has gone from pariah to potential partner. And that's quite a big change. And also just the idea of an American president going to Moscow for a formal meeting with the Russian president in Russia. That's just very different from the last decade. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so Putin invited Trump to visit Moscow. If that's going to happen, if it does happen, that will be big. I think the last U.S. president to Russia was President Obama in 2013. So it hasn't happened for a long time. And that would really signify a big change, I think, in East-West relations. And what do we think has gone on here? Because I see a lot of kind of security commentators suggesting that Putin has kind of got one over on Trump by even getting the phone call in the first place, let alone the outcome of the phone call. Well, I mean, there's no doubt that Vladimir Putin has got what he wants, right, Ian? The talks haven't begun yet. We don't know what the final outline of a peace plan will be. But just with this phone call alone is a diplomatic victory, I'd say, for Vladimir Putin, because it gives him what it wants. He's now able to negotiate on Ukraine directly with America, directly with the U.S. president, and that he said all along that that's what he wants to do, not talk to Europe or to Ukraine, but to talk directly to Washington. And it seems that that's what's going to happen, right? The America and Russia are getting their negotiating teams together. Talks will begin very soon. There's no suggestion that Europe will be sitting at the table or Ukraine not to begin with. So that's good for Putin. The other thing he put himself back at the top table of international politics where he believes he belongs, somewhere where he can be rubbed shoulders with the President of the United States and sort out the big problems of the world. And he has been an outcast in the eyes of many world leaders for the last 3 years. In a sense, Donald Trump has brought him back from the cold, and we found out about this phone call on Wednesday night. In one of the things we have to get used to in the Trump era is that Trump does something, talks about it, and then the 24 hours afterwards, there's then sometimes some differences emerge or some clarifications or some reinterpretations, or just some consequences, plain old-fashioned consequences. What would you like to tell us about the reaction to this call so far? It's been very positive in Russia. Russian television has a daily UKK talk show, and it kicked off today with the host saying this has been a sharp turn and historic shift, referring to U.S. policy. On Uzia, the Kremlin has been very positive about what's happening. I spoke to President Putin's spokesman today on his daily conference call. Dmitry Pesov said it was a very important call. And he said that there'd been no contacts between Moscow and Washington for several years, so he was hoping that was going to change now. So the Kremlin's pretty happy. We haven't heard directly from Vladimir Putin. He was shown on Russian television, meeting a regional governor. No reference, no comment about the phone call with Donald Trump. But interesting, I read the newspapers the Russian newspapers this morning, and one said that this telephone call had placed a big fat full stop in the question of Russia's so-called international isolation. And that's what Russian officials are very pleased about that for 3 years, after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Western governments made efforts to isolate Russia. You had thousands of international sanctions being imposed on Russia. Vladimir Putin was ostracized. He was issued with an arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court. And yet now we have the US president picking up the phone and happy to chat to Putin for 90 minutes and praising his common sense. It's a huge shift in America's approach to Russia, and the Russians taking that as a diplomatic victory and a confident, I think that, when it gets down to the nitty-gritty, the nuts and bolts of a potential deal, that it will benefit Russia. And finally, Steve, just when these negotiations do begin between Moscow and Washington about the fate of Ukraine, what would Vladimir Putin's opening position be? And what do we think? His kind of red lines, his final position could end up being, well, certainly, Ukrainian membership of NATO is a big red line for the Russians, but, listening to Donald Trump yesterday and the U.S. Secretary of Defense, that is not on the table. It doesn't look as if that is going to happen. Basically, Vladimir Putin wants everything he said he wanted over the last sort of year and a half. Russian officials constantly refer you back to Putin's peace proposal, so-called peace proposal of June last year, which actually didn't read like a peace initiative. It was more like an ultimatum decay. He wants to keep all the territory that he seized and occupied in Ukraine over the last 3 years. He's also talked about getting more territory that's still under Ukrainian control in the regions he's semi-occupied. He wants Western sanctions to be scrapped. He doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO, possibly the European Union too, and there's been no hint. So far in comments he's made and speeches he's delivered that he's prepared to compromise on any of that. We'll have to see, when it gets down to negotiations, what the final deal will actually look like. But I think there'll be concern in Kiev, in Ukraine, that this thaw in relations between Washington and Moscow will not serve Ukraine's purpose here. Steve, thank you very much. You're welcome. So thanks to Steve Rosenberg for giving us that side of the story. Lee, in terms of what EU leaders have been saying, I mean, this phone call and these comments from the Americans sparked a massive round of diplomatic activity amongst European leaders and European defense secretaries, didn't they? Every day, ad seems to bring Noom shells. It feels like a firing range now in terms of the world diplomacy. But we will expect that they will reiterate that any negotiations on Ukraine should involve a joint negotiating position involving Ukraine, Europe, and the United States. This would have been accepted, taken as normal and natural under President Biden's administration. But of course, it is a new administration and a whole new worldview coming from Washington. The Ukrainian's President Zelensky, who I think has been stunned by what he has heard. He will certainly make those points, and he will make it, of course, here to an audience, which is largely supportive of his approach to negotiations, his ambitions for a future resolution of the Ukraine conflict. I mean, everyone wants the war to end, most of all the Ukrainians, but it has to be a negotiation involving all sides. And this is what the Europeans are certain to say tomorrow. There's certain to be discussion, too, about what we have heard from the U.S. Defense Secretary saying again, and this is not new. President Trump said it in his first term, that other NATO members, Europe have to pay more for their defense. Before it was, 2 to 3%. Now Pete Heat has been saying it has to be 5%. The U.S. pays 4% of its defense spending here in NATO, but he wants the Europeans to pay 5%. So there will be discussion. I think we should point out we're discussing Ukraine, but NATO is very much part of it, and the message on NATO is more en coup for European partners and for Canada. Because no longer is President Trump threatening to leave the NATO military alliance. In fact, the U.S. Defense Secretary used that same mantra, refashioned it, and said, let's make NATO great again. Let's have Europeans spending more. not expecting the United States to take care of their defense, so that certainly will be discussed here tomorrow, because Mark Richer, the NATO Secretary General, will also be here, but he will try to find good and opportunities in this current moment. At least your line's breaking up a little bit there because you're surrounded presumably by loads of people glued to their phones about what's happening because the situation changes minute by minute, but I'm about to ask you an impossible question, and feel free to dodge it if you want. But in a year's time, do you think we'll look back on this week and think, oh, that was the point at which a PTH to peace in Ukraine it was embarked upon? This feels like a defining moment. It feels like a dangerous moment for Ukrainians. Possibly the most dangerous moment since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which is almost 3 years ago to the day it was set. Entrain a process, but if this process as it is being laid out, now follow it will not be peace for Ukraine, and Europeans will not see this as a moment where the continent, where Europeans can feel at peace. Great thanks, Lee. Good thank. Now, a BBC investigation has established that the Chancellor's LinkedIn social media profile, where she sets out her career, exaggerated the length of time that she worked at the Bank of England before she became an MP. Rachel Reeves left the bank 9 months earlier than her CV says, and it means she spent 5.5 years working at the Bank of England, despite claiming to have spent, in her words, the best part of a decade working there. And that story has been brought to us by our very own Chris Mason. Hello, Chris, hello, right? Let's have a look at Rachel Reeves's CV and her LinkedIn page and work out what it says and what you've actually found out. Yeah, so Rachel Reeves has faced questions about her LinkedIn profile before newscasters might remember that from the autumn. And so when that happened, we decided we would take a more detailed look, and it said that she worked at the Bank of England from September 2000 until December 2006. What we managed to find out is that she actually left in March 2006 when she began working at Halifax Bank of Scotland, known as HBOS in Halifax in West Georgia. Now we got hold of a photo that had been taken in March 2006 where she's sitting alongside HBOS staff at a lunch, the Council of Mortgage Lenders annual lunch, and a former human resources person at HBOS who helped the now Chancellor do the whole relocation thing from London to West Yorkshire when she took the job at HBOS said that she could also recall that Rachel Reeves's first day was in March 2006 now, as she'd already started at HBOS by the spring of that year. Her time at the central bank amounted to 5.5 years, and this included nearly a year where she was studying for a master's at the London School of Economics. Now let's compare that with what she has said in a speech about a year ago at a business conference, Labour Party. Business conference, she said, "I spent the best part of a decade as an economist at the Bank of England," and she repeated the claim in another interview and in the Labour Party document, and all this matters because Rachel Reeves has pointed at her time as an economist at the Bank of England as part of the reason that she argue she can be trusted with the country's finances as for what she has had to say. Well, a spokeswoman didn't dispute what we found out, added that the Chancellor was proud of the jobs that she did and the experience that she gained before she became a Member of Parliament in 2010. The spokeswoman also said that the dates were inaccurate due to an administrative error by a member of the team, and the Chancellor didn't see it before it was published. And there's also a discrepancy with when she actually left Halifax Bank of Scotland HBOS. Yeah, so this LinkedIn profile stated that she left HBOS in December 2009, about 6 months before the general election in 2010, in May 2010. In fact, we established that her employment at HBOS finished in May 2009. She signed a compromise agreement. We've obtained the invoice for the legal advice that she was given on that agreement, which stated that it arose from a decision your employer to terminate your employment. Now, a compromise agreement. It's now known as a settlement agreement. It's a legal document between an employer and an employee. HBOS was undergoing restructuring at the time of her departure. Her spokesman for the Chancellor said she had taken voluntary redundancy. Oh, and guess what on all of this stuff? That LinkedIn page this morning changed and talked to us, Ab. This other story about Rachel Reeves's expenses from when she was working at HBoss? Yeah, so the same HBoss employee, and I know this gets a little bit kind of complicated, but the same HBoss employee who last autumn was saying that Rachel Reeves had wrongly claimed on her CV that she was an economist at Halifax, Bank of Scotland. My voice survives. The rest of the day went frightfully high-pitched for a moment there. That person who made that post last autumn. What happened? After that was that the detail changed about her time at HBot and the job that she had done. That person also made allegations about expenses which Rachel Reeves vigorously denied. But we've also been looking into this over the last couple of months, and we've learned that there was an expenses investigation into Rachel Reeves and 2 other senior managers. Detailed 6-page whistleblowing complaint. Dozens of pages of attached evidence, we have seen them. It raised concerns that the 3 managers were using the bank's money to thunder lifestyle, as it was put, with spending on dinners and events and taxes and gifts, including for each other. A senior source with age of the investigation found that there appeared to have been a breaking of the rules, but there is no evidence of which we're aware that the bank's internal investigation was completed, or that there was ever a concluding finding of any wrongdoing. There is no suggestion that the departures of any of the 3 managers, of which Rachel Reeves was one, were linked to the investigation, or to spend in issues. A spokesman for the Chancellor tells us that she left HBoss on good terms, and her team also provided a statement from the lawyer who provided her with some of the legal advice about her departure from HBoss due to the restructuring, and he said it was a standard style agreement adopted by the company when a mutually agreed exit was made during the bank's restructure. Absolutely no allegations of wrongdoing or misconduct were mentioned by the HBoss HR team during this process, a lawyer said, and a spokesman or spokeswoman for Rachel Reeves said she was proud of the work that she'd done at HBoss and was not aware of these claims about her expenses until we approached her and told her about it. And I mean, what does this mean for the Chancellor's reputation as we record this on Thursday lunchtime? Yes, so we're recording this at 1:30 on Thursday lunchtime. You know, Chan had a tough old time in her opening months as Chancellor, principally because of the whole business of the state of the economy, and we've seen that, haven't we? With these figures out today, then there was that scrutiny around her CV back in the autumn. And this is more of that, isn't it, that allows her critics, and they are doing that to raise questions about her judgment. That's the argument that the conservatives, KY Basso, and others are making, and I think that it refuels those awkward questions for her, and I just see just popping into my email inbox is some copy, as we call it, when we send each other emails from a visit Keir Starmer's been doing, and he was asked about this, and he has given a response of a sort. Yeah, so he has said that the Chancellor has dealt with any issues that arise after questions were posed following this investigation, and when he was asked whether he was comfortable that she had exaggerated her relevant experience, he said that it was many years ago, but that these days the Chancellor and he get up every day to make sure the economy in our country, which was badly damaged under the last Labour government, so claims SK Starmer is revived, and we have growth, and that is felt in the pockets, actually, says Pickett's here. But I think it means pockets, rather than any industrial action, of working people across the country. And now here is a slight sidebar to this whole story, or these multiple stories that you've been working on. The Conservative response where they say, oh, Keir's got questions to answer about all of this. Because he said he was going to be super ethical and everything was going to be white and above board, they have used a clearly AI-generated picture of Rachel Reeves surrounded by swag. And I think that's interesting because it now means the bar has been set amongst politicians that using AI-generated images to attack your opponents is totally fine. Yeah, and that raises far wider questions, doesn't it? Beyond the conversation we're thing about this particular piece of journalism. And, and the stuff around the expenses is nuanced and is subtle and is not immediately straightforward. And you can read the whole thing, the whole investigation from Billy Caber and Phil K. Kemp to brilliant colleagues of ours on the BBC News app. But yeah, that wider question about the legitimacy or otherwise of using these tools to mock stuff up is a really interesting one now. If you do it in a sort of theatrical, arguably sort of mildly over-the-top way, I guess, that's one thing because few people are going to think it is genuine. You might be making a point, that point may or may not be fair, but few people are likely to think that it's a genuine picture. Where I think it gets much more interesting, that's something of euphemism, is were we to start seeing, not necessarily from the main parties, but just from anyone, images that basically are fake, that are sufficiently believable that we, either as journalists or just, somebody scrolling through social media, sort of believes to be real. Chris, thank you very much, Tara. Now, I mentioned with Chris there about that AI-generated artwork on the conservatives' post on social media today, because I think a lot of the time when we talk about artificial intelligence and the technology and the implications, it's all pretty theoretical. And so whenever I see an example that I can really understand in the real world, I kind of jump on it and think we should talk about it. And we're going to do that again now, because this week there was an example about the opportunities and threats of artificial intelligence in this very building where we do BBC News. And it was a post on social media by our CEO of BBC News, Deborah Tess, about some research the BBC had done into how various artificial intelligence chatbots gave answers using content that they got from BBC News. In other words, how did AI interpret the news stories that we had covered? And Deborah is here now to explain it all to us. Hello, Deborah. Hello. Right, what is this research the BBC did? What did you find out? Okay. So we've been worried for the last few months about this idea of distortion, which is when generative AI search engines like ChatGPT or Perplexity or others that people are starting to use more and more, that when they search for answers to questions about news, that the answers they give are inaccurate, faulty, wrong, and misleading. And so as the world's most trusted news provider, the BBC thought, well, we'll try and get ahead of this because nobody else seemed to be doing research in this area, and we went away and did some research just to get the ball rolling and get the conversation started. And what we found was that in more than half of the cases and more than half the searches, the AI chatbot search engine returned false information and dangerously wrong content along the lines. Well, for example, when asked, it decided that, and told us that Rishi Sunak and Nicola Sturgeon were still in power. When asked about the government's policy on vaping, it gave the exact opposite of the current NHS advice about how to give up smoking, which does actually encourage vaping. It said it did not encourage vaping, and so on and so forth. And so in so many of its answers, you were getting faulty responses. One very important one was about Israel-Gaza, which we know is one of the most contentious stories of our times. And it ascribed opinion to the BBC content that it had searched. So it sort of said that we'd said certain things about Iran or about Israel that we would never say said. That we had said Iran had responded with restraint exactly, and that Israel's actions were aggressive. And as an impartial news organization, we would not use that language. We would quote others who might have used it, but we'd always attribute that, in the AI search B did not. And obviously we really do invest an awful lot of time and energy in achieving impartiality so that we maintain people's trust. And so by the search engine delivering that result, it calls into question our impartiality, and it's arguably dangerous for democracy. Yeah, so you found this out now. I mean, we all suspected it, but we've got some evidence now. What do you want to do with it, with this evidence? So look, I think we need to open up conversation with the providers, the tech codes that are driving and growing these chatbots, and with government as well, because there are so many areas, aren't there, where we're seeing the dangers of AI. And please don't get me wrong, AI is a fantastic new resource and tool. It's going to enable us to do all sorts of things that we couldn't do before. At BBC News and across DBC, we are beginning to deploy AI to do so many things. and it's going to make us more efficient. Make us you reach more audiences with more content is going to be very useful and valuable. But we have to thing about this particular piece of journalism and the stuff around the expenses is nuanced and is subtle and is not immediately straightforward, and you can read the whole thing, the whole investigation from Billy Caber and Phil K. Kemp to brilliant colleagues of ours on the BBC News app. But yeah, that wider question about the legitimacy or otherwise of using these tools to mock stuff up is a really interesting one now. If you do it in a sort of theatrical, arguably sort of mildly over the top way, I guess. That's one thing, because few people are going to think it is genuine. You might be making a point, that point may or may not be fair, but few people are likely to think that it's a genuine picture. Where I think it gets much more interesting, that's something of euphemism, is were we to start seeing, not necessarily from the main parties, but just from anyone, images that basically are fake, that are sufficiently believable that we either as journalists or just, somebody scrolling through social media sort of believes to be real. Chris, thank you very much, Tara. Now, I mentioned with Chris there about that AI-generated artwork on the conservatives' post on social media today, because I think a lot of the time when we talk about artificial intelligence and the technology and the implications, it's all pretty theoretical. And so whenever I see an example that I can really understand, in the real world, I kind of jump on it and think we should talk about it. And we're going to do that again now. Because this week there was an example about the opportunities and threats of artificial intelligence in this very building where we do BBC News, and it was a post on social media by our CEO of BBC News, Deborah Tess, about some research the BBC had done into how various artificial intelligence chatbots gave answers using content that they got from BBC News. In other words, how did AI interpret the news stories that we had covered? And Deborah is here now to explain it all to us. Hello, Deborah. Hello. Right, what is this research the BBC did? What did you find out? Okay, so we've been worried for the last few months about this idea of distortion, which is when generative AI search engines like ChatGPT or Perplexity or others that people are starting to use more and more, that when they search for answers to questions about news, that the answers they give are inaccurate, faulty, wrong, and misleading. And so, as the world's most trusted news provider, the BBC thought, well, we'll try and get ahead of this because nobody else seemed to be doing research in this area. And we went away and did some research just to get the ball rolling and get the conversation started. And what we found was that in more than half of the cases, and more than half the searches, the AI chatbot search engine returned false information and dangerously wrong content along the lines of, well, for example, when asked, it decided that, and told us that Rishi Sunak, and Nicola Sturgeon were still in power. When asked about the government's policy on vaping, it gave the exact opposite of the current NHS advice about how to give up smoking, which does actually encourage vaping. It said it did not encourage vaping, and so on and so forth. And so, in so many of its answers, you were getting faulty responses. One very important one was about Israel-Gaza, which we know is one of the most contentious stories of our times. And it ascribed opinion to the BBC content that it had searched. So it sort of said that we'd said certain things about Iran or about Israel that we would never say. Yeah, said. That we had said Iran had responded with restraint, exactly, and that Israel's actions were aggressive, and as an impartial news organization, we would not use that language. We would quote others who might have used it, but we'd always attribute that, and the AI search B did not. And obviously, we really do invest an awful lot of time and energy in achieving impartiality so that we maintain people's trust. And so by the search engine delivering that result, it calls into question our impartiality, and it's arguably dangerous for democracy. Yeah, so you found this out now. I mean, we all suspected it, but we've got some evidence now. What do you want to do with it, with this evidence? So, look, I think we need to open up a conversation with the providers, the tech codes that are driving and growing these chatbots, And with government as well, because there are so many areas, aren't there, where we're seeing the dangers of AI. And please don't get me wrong. AI is a fantastic new resource and tool. It's going to enable us to do all sorts of things that we couldn't do before at BBC News. And across DBC, we are beginning to deploy AI to do so many things. And it's going to make us more efficient. You reach more audiences with more content is going to be very useful and valuable. But we have to gents. And one of the things Apple Intelligence does is it summarizes news alerts, because you'll see you get lots of news alerts on your phone all throughout the day, and it didn't summarize them very well. Well, yes, you'll be aware, and there was news coverage of it at the time. It came back with really contorted versions of the news, which were often, again, I'll use the word dangerous because I do think this is a dangerous area. So, the Apple summary said that when we had read a story about a Brazilian tennis player who'd come out, it actually said that it was Rafa Nadal. And incorrectly, when we reported in a news summary that law officials had arrested looters in some of the houses that been destroyed by fires, the Apple Intelligence reported that the LA officials had been arrested for doing the looting. Yeah, and Luigi Mannon, who allegedly murdered the healthcare boss on the street of New York. The Apple technology said that he had shot himself. All of these false, fake, badly wrong, and hugely damaging for BBC News, given that our logo was positioned next to all of these summaries. But what I want to say is credit where credit is due. We alerted Apple to this issue. We spoke to them, sat down with them, and they have paused this feature for their news and entertainment section. So they're no longer using that technology because it patently isn't working. And they had the courage and the transparency to say, you know what, we've heard you were going to press pause, and we want others to hear and see our research and to have this conversation about what we should do about it. I mean, do you want OpenAI just to pick one company at random to pause their chatbot access to the news to sort of do an Apple, I would say? And I wouldn't want to pick out any individual tech company. What I'd say is, until the technology can get it right, perhaps they should steer away from news, because how long will it be until a distorted news response to a search gives a reply that is dangerous for the whole world? We can see what's happening in Israel, Gaza. We can see what's happening in Ukraine and other places. It doesn't take much for a false headline, particularly if it's got the BBC stamp next to it, or it's attributed to the BBC, for that to be believed by thousands, millions of people, and for there to boom kind of real-world response. And we've seen in recent years how what starts on social media or starts as fake news can provoke terrifying real-world responses. And that's the danger here. And who's liable for that? Where does that liability sit? I think we could all just slow it down a little when it comes to news. Is what I would say, press pause on technology and work together to work out what good looks like in this area. Well, I'm just trying to work out what pressing pause on the technology looks like, because a version of that would be what I sort of just hinted at there, that if I go on one of these chatbots and type in a prompt of, what does the BBC say about story X? You're sort of suggesting that function shouldn't be available for a bit. Or I think the chatbot could give you a compendium of content from news providers which keeps it intact, which they have worked on. They have cleared through their compliance procedures. We have many at the BBC News, so that the chatbot knows that what it is serving up is what was actually created in the first place. It's this idea of the chatbot not being able to discern between impartial news, opinionated news, and false news, and mixing it all up in the response that is not good technology, and that is not a good outcome. And until we can get good outcomes, I would say let's not scrape and distort the news, and just serve it in the form in which it was actually published. And it's interesting because when I first read the research that came out a couple of days ago, I thought, oh, that's really interesting. Let's chat to Deborah about it. But then when I thought about it a bit more, I was like, well, actually, how many people get their news by going on the chat bot and typing in a question about the news? That's just our particular way of using this technology. And so I thought, well, actually, are we now worrying about a quite minor way people use to get their news? But actually, from what you're saying, it's the whole AI ecosystem as a technology, in general. And this is just an example of how it sometimes doesn't work. It's not necessarily the chat boot themselves that we're just zooming in on. What you're going to see is increased use of this kind of technology on the world's search engines, so that what you will get when you ask a question, what's going on in Ukraine with Donald Trump, you will not, as today, you'll mostly get a response that gives you links to different news outlets. What you will get increasingly is a long stream of content which has been scraped and mixed together to give you the response by AI, and any links topple is real. And I really want to commend them, because they are among the biggest in the world, of course, and they are leaders in the sector, and we are grateful and hopeful that by working with them we can get their technology to a better place and to show others what good looks like. But we do need to work with government, and we do need to invite them all to come and have the conversation. So we might be having a summit in this building broadcasting house where it's you, Peter Kyle, the technology secretary, Elon Musk, Sam Allman, well, and BC Pastries. I'm definitely turning up for that meeting if we can pull that crowd together. Yes, Deborah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for highlighting this issue for us. And that is all from this entirely human intelligence episode of Newscast. Thank you very much for listening. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye-bye.